Okay, good morning to everybody, and we'll go ahead and get started. I think it's 9 o'clock, and looks like we have a few people on the live Zoom link, so that's good. That's always good to see people joining us live, and feel free to ask your questions. I know that I think I mentioned on Tuesday that we've been having some difficulties with me being able to hear you on the microphones. There are a couple of microphones in this room. This room is specially equipped with a camera, video equipment, and uplink to our network that we compress the file and upload it to YouTube. For some reason, we had these things turned off, and I did my best the other day to try to fix that. So if anybody has a question, wants to try to talk to me, you can try at some point. If it doesn't work, then I'm going to try something different. I was going to call AV, and then I thought it was after class. And I thought, well, I'm really going to have a live class to do it in, and so if it doesn't work, then we'll figure something out. I'll get them out here on Monday, and so for going forward, we should be okay. But if in the meantime, if you have questions, feel free to just type something in the chat box, and I do see it. It just pops up, and so it's easy for me to see what's going on. So okay, a couple of brief notes about where we are in the class. We're going to cover the rest of chapter 11 today, and it looks like we're maybe just a slight bit behind the schedule. But I'm not terribly worried at all about it, because I think this is usually about where we are in the semester. Now, I think I've told the class several times, this is the first time we've used this particular textbook in a setting in which in which I talk and for an hour and 15 minutes and whatnot. So it's a little bit, we're a little bit on some unproven ground as to how long it takes to get through some of the content. So that's why it's a little bit unclear. When we use the default textbook that we've had before, which actually cost you a lot of money, students a lot of money, we knew pretty well where we would be and at what points. But we've since adopted this free textbook, so which I think I've not heard too many complaints about, frankly, but which is sort of good. So anyway, we'll cover the rest of chapter 11 today. Probably either today or tomorrow. I'll send everybody. I'll make a posting to the general announcement on the main page, just so you know this is coming. And I'll probably also follow up with an email individually to you, or as a group, and then it'll come to your individual email. And just basically, it's just a checkout message. In the courses in which students are not physically with me, and there's no or there's limited interaction sort of interpersonally, I like to reach out somewhere around the midpoint of the semester. I mean, I know it's not right exactly the midpoint, but just to stay in touch. And if you have questions, feel free to reply to me by email, or just ignore it, whatever you prefer. But feel free to reply if any questions or concerns that you might have. It's just a good point of getting together. For whatever reason, a lot of students don't avail themselves of office hours at CNN. I've never really known why, because I've taught at places before where my office hours are just cram-packed with students. And I've heard other faculty at other universities and colleges say the same, but I think it's just kind of our culture where we don't really do that much. And I've always encouraged people to take advantage of it. And to also, if that time doesn't work, because I know it's sort of arbitrary, and we sort of pick it based on our convenience, basically, which may not be yours. And frankly, that's too bad. It's unfortunate. And but rather than just simply saying too bad, I would simply say, if there's a better time, let me know. I don't have to be anywhere else. And so if you need me to meet me at the Montoya campus, I can do that, or whatever. So I am available to you. I really am. And it's unfortunate that our office hours sometimes don't coincide with everyone's schedules. But at least in the Attend Anywhere format, we've given you lots of options for how to attend and to work through the material. So it looks like a lot of people are availing themselves of the playback option in YouTube. And if you do that, again, I just want to remind everybody to be sure to go in and record your attendance on each week's attendance link. It's under content discussions, and click on content and discussions in Brightspace. Every week we'll have a dedicated link for that. Okay. Okay. So excuse me, I'm still getting over this cough here, and I passed the self-assessment that we have to take every day we come to class, because it's not a new cough. I've had it for a little while. I do tend to think it's more asthma and allergy related than anything else, because I feel fine otherwise. So we're going to cover the rest of chapter 11, dealing with aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And I know that I was unsure because I've seen so many different ways in textbooks as to whether or not the textbook authors listed aggregate supply as aggregate supply in the short run, as I have done on the PowerPoint package, or as SRAS. It turns out the textbook has it that way. So I'm going to refer to it that way in my graphs, even though in my PowerPoints and even on Tuesday's presentation, I had that as the former year. I'm going to just do this just so that people aren't confused. It's the same thing. I mean, it's just a different way of saying it. It would be very nice if economists could agree on really anything, but you kind of get the idea. So we're going to move into chapter 12 today. I don't think we'll get done with it. It's really chapters 12 and 13 sort of go together, really. They go together in the sense that they are really two distinctly and really opposing theoretical worldviews of how macroeconomies operate. So they kind of go together in the sense that they're opposite and competing. There is a lot of overlap and agreement, however. So there's no disagreement about what a supply curve looks like or something like that. There is some disagreement about the aggregate supply curve. We're going to get to that here in a second. But it's more involving what are the inherent conditions by which economies operate. And the Keynesian view, which we're going to be looking at today, has the assumption that economies are inherently unstable and therefore require some sort of government prodding, nudging, intervention at times to keep things on the road, to keep the car on the road, in other words. The neoclassical view, which is derived from some of the earliest thinking regarding economics, is that economies are pretty stable. They can, move along. They can, plod along on their own. They don't require a lot of government intervention because intervention is really tantamount to interference, and that when government gets involved, they simply make a mess of things. And so, as a result, the neoclassicists believe that the less government involvement, the better. So those are pretty two opposing worldviews, and those aren't the only opposing particular views, but we will get to those. And by the way, I've got some PowerPoint slides which go along with this, and I thought I'd post them all together in the same week next week because they do really sort of flow together, and it'll allow you then really in one file to sort of see what some of the differences are, so you can sort of scroll up and down to see what the differences are. So week 10 will take us through the neoclassical perspective. I don't know if we're going to get to chapter 14, which deals with money and banking. That may have to wait until after the third exam, just given where we are. I'd like to stay on track with the exam schedule. You notice we have another exam coming up, and that's next week. So I do want to make some time available on Tuesday, week from Tuesday, the 22nd, to talk about the next exam. And then we'll have that exam, same format as the first two, and I'll have an open Zoom link during class. I know that I had an open Zoom link during the second exam. The first exam, we weren't here because we had a snow day, I think, as I recall. But the second one, people would pop in and I would say, "Hello, can I help you?" And I think people thought it was kind of creepy because it was just me sitting here. And but I had said to the class that I'm just here to answer questions if you have any last minute questions. And I think some people didn't know quite what to do about it. And so that's fine. If you want to pop in and ask a question, feel free. No problem. And if you tried and maybe the mics weren't working, that's another thing. I don't know if the mics were working then or not, but you are always free to use the chat link, or just to simply call me. That's particularly useful, and I can certainly talk to you that way. I will try to get this thing resolved, if it's not already resolved, with the microphones here next week. So we should be okay going forward. Somebody somewhere probably flipped the switch, and that's what's happening. Okay. All right. So questions for me about anything that we have talked about so far, and where we're going. Okay. So let's talk about the rest of what we began talking about on Tuesday. Remember, chapter 11 deals with really sort of the beginnings of macro modeling. And from there, we're going to be building a number of different models that we'll be using throughout the course that will allow us to sort of see graphically what some of the macroeconomic relationships are, what some of how we would model what some of the problems are, whether those problems are recession and unemployment on the one hand, excessive growth and inflation on the other, which is maybe where we are right now, I know that sometimes when we say excessive growth, that sounds like a good problem to have. However, it's not a good problem when it's inflationary. And right now we've got definite inflationary pressures. And I don't think you can argue that we're not growing very quickly, because we are at about as low an unemployment rate as has been seen, I think, in anybody's lifetime. In fact, almost anybody who's alive, really, quite frankly. I think the only difference would be maybe World War II, when so many people were employed, and particularly in the civilian workforce, much less than those who were in uniform, but the civilian workforce, because we had new entrants in the workforce at that time, in the fact that women really entered the labor force, particularly in the industrial sector, really for the first time in a major way in this country. They have in other countries, but not so much here. But that's about the last time we've seen this much, this low of an unemployment rate. Now, there are issues with labor force participation. That is, there are some people who are falling out of the labor force because we're simply no longer counting them, because they've given up looking, or they just want to withdraw from working, or they're concerned over COVID, which are, obviously concerns that people do have. And so it could be that, I mean, we're not at some sort of record for adult population working, because that's actually somewhat low by historical standards. So, what it tells us is that, with the low unemployment rate, means that we could probably absorb more people into the labor force. And anybody who's been looking around at all has seen a lot of people, a lot of places hiring. In fact, almost every retail establishment that I have gone into or been by recently has got some sort of sign out front saying we're hiring. I was in Walmart last night, and some of the jobs are going for $16.50 an hour, because it was like a big table, and they had some of them were just $13 per hour. Some were, but I think the highest one I saw was $16.50 per hour. I assume it was full time. I don't know. But that would translate to about $34,000 per year, and I'm sure with benefits. I don't know what Walmart's benefits are, but you get the idea that we're growing very, very quickly, and that may come to an end. It may come to an end, frankly. I think it probably is going to, just simply because of the fact that when we get to these peaks, it feels like we're at sort of a peak and inflection point right now, and that we're going to be taking a dip downward. I would not be surprised if that happens, but let's hope it's shallow and short. Okay. So when we talked about the first part of this model building, we talked about aggregate demand, and we went through aggregate demand in terms of its configuration, that it was downward sloping. We said why it was, mostly because of its relationship to the price level. That is, we tend to buy more goods when they're cheaper, obviously, and then fewer goods when they're more expensive. Some of that has to do with foreign trade. When foreign goods are more expensive, we buy less of those and more domestic made goods, etc. We talked about shifts in aggregate demand. Now let's move on to aggregate supply. So we're going to talk about I guess I could draw it a little straighter there. Let's talk about the aggregate supply curve. And again, we are no longer dealing with PQ plane, which we began talking about back in chapter 3, which was a model of a economic model, a microeconomic market, whatever that market would be, the market for shoes or whatever. Instead, we're talking about the PY plane, P being the price level based upon some price index, such as the GDP deflator, which seeks to capture thousands of goods being sold in the economy, and takes out imports because it's just domestically produced goods. Or maybe the CPI, which is a consumer price index, and then G is real, or Y is real GDP. Okay, and then we have an upward sloping aggregate supply curve, which we don't just simply label as aggregate supply, we refer to it as short run aggregate supply. And the reasons for that are going to become a little bit clearer here in just a bit. So let's talk about why it's upward sloping in the first place. And so it's important for us to know that there's a direct relationship between the price level and the output of producers. And this is not all that different, really, from the discussion of aggregate demand, from demand from back in the day. So if we start at some P0 here, and the economy on the supply side is producing some Y0 amount of output, and the price level is going up, then what are sellers motivated to do? They're motivated to provide more output. And why wouldn't they? And as the price level goes up, they're motivated to provide even more output. And the reasons for this are pretty obvious. If you're a seller, sellers want high prices, right? Or higher prices. And buyers want low prices. There's no disputing that. That's not a particularly controversial idea. Now there is debate about how high a price sellers would want, and there are times in which sellers might not necessarily want just the maximum price possible, because there is a point at which substitutes do come into play where people will say, you know what, I can really do without this good. And there are goods in which the supply side, I think, this is just my observation, I don't really study this market, but I think something like cable TV, I think the cable companies are beginning to price themselves out of the market. I'm a shareholder in AT&T, which owns DirecTV, and I've been sort of punished for that. AT&T is not doing that well. I think it's probably because DirecTV and all these other providers, I know it's not cable, it's satellite, but they're beginning to sort of price themselves out of the market. It's rather costly. And cable TV is, I think, even worse. And so you kind of get the idea. There are substitutes like Sling and YouTube TV and Netflix, and Netflix is not a perfect substitute, but there are a lot of other ways to get entertainment and whatnot, so and information and sports. And so I think you're seeing that begin to happen. But nonetheless, there is that motivation. If the price is going up, suppliers want to provide more output. And if the price is going down, the same is the case. So the same situation when the price is going down. So that's why it's upward sloping. This is not really all that different than the micro supply curve, which basically captures prices. What is a little bit different here is something that we're going to talk a little bit more about. We talk about Keynesian theory, and that's the idea of sticky prices and wages. And that is this: if you're a seller of goods, and we've already sort of alluded to this idea, we haven't really referred to this term yet as sticky. The term sticky comes from John Maynard Keynes himself. And when we say sticky, we're saying they get gummed up, they don't move quickly, they just get jammed in place, at least in the short run, where we sort of live our lives. And that is, if you're a seller of goods and prices are rising, then you're motivated to provide more output as a result to try to chase that. Meantime, your workers are they're not along for the ride right away, at least. Because as prices are rising, you can raise your price of your output without changing the price of your input at all, if most of your input is a labor cost. So eventually, yes, the workers will catch up and get higher wages because they will demand higher wages. And we'll talk about what that really means. It doesn't mean that they, on a monthly basis, go into their employer and say, "You're the latest consumer price index data. It was up 1% last month, and therefore I need a 1% increase in pay. And if it's up again next month, I'll be back next month for that." We know that that's not a very realistic scenario, and that any kind of price increase is going to be well after the fact and may or may not capture the full rate of inflation that's been happening. And in fact, I think there's a lot of evidence that such raises do not capture the full rate of inflation. I think there's ample evidence that over time, a lot of workers do not experience catch up in wages, at least for a time. And so it's the case. And so as a result of this, these sticky wages, they don't catch up. And so firms are free to raise prices. Also on the downside, it works the same way on the downside. If prices are falling, and I know this is a little bit less common of a scenario where prices in general, remember we're talking about the macro economy here, where prices in general are falling. We don't see deflation too often for very long time periods. In fact, in my lifetime, and I think I have been around probably longer than most everyone here, there's only really been 1 year where we could really count on, we could say that prices as a whole fell. I'm not just talking about a single good like, oil or whatever, that is very volatile anyway, but prices in general, that was 2009 when prices fell a little bit, and then they got pumped back up because our economy tends to inflate. But if they do fall, then workers are going to be loath to take a wage cut, and firms are going to just dial down their output instead, dial down their output, and they will hire fewer workers. And that is something that Keynes talked a lot about. We will get to that very shortly. By the way, if we talk about Keynesian economic theory, he was very much a short-run theorist, And I know that sometimes he gets criticism for this, or received criticism for this, because of his fixation of the short run. But he was writing in a different sort of time period, and he actually responded to this criticism by saying, in the long run, we're all dead. Now, that is obviously an extreme statement, but he was responding to a direct criticism. And in fact, he was writing his most important work during the Great Depression, where his major work was published in 1936, which was well into the Great Depression, and governments around the world couldn't figure it out by then. And it was really an emergency work that he wrote. And he wrote it very quickly. And for somebody who's been unfortunate enough to have to read it, it is a very difficult read. Okay, so that's essentially what's going on with the short run notion of the aggregate supply curve. Now let's do this. Let's because now we've talked about supply as being this sort of downward sloping, or I'm sorry, upward sloping sort of thing. But we've got a different conception, and it sort of follows along in all theories, whether it's the neoclassical or the Keynesian view, and that is the idea of an aggregate supply curve that in the long run is more vertical. And let's talk about why that is. So let's say that we have, and we'll start with some SRAS 0. Okay, and we'll start with some initial P0, and we're going to see how we get to this vertical long run aggregate supply configuration. How on earth do we get there? And why does it come about in the first place? And it's like, yikes, now we have a vertical supply curve. How does that happen? Well, okay, let's give an idea. Well, we'll go back to this first notion here of rising prices and sticky wages. So prices are rising, prices are rising, prices are rising. And as a result of this, what's going on? Well, given the fact that prices are rising, firms are going to provide more output, right? And I could get into this whole business of, the arrows here, but I think you probably got the idea from this. Plus, you've got ample readings on this. What I want to focus on is the action here. Okay, so we said in the very short run that workers' wages don't catch up with rising prices. Now, why is this fixation on workers' wages as one among all of the input costs? Because remember, when we talked about factors of production, we talked about land, labor, capital, all this sort of thing. And so we've got capital goods inputs, machine tools and 18-wheelers and computers and all this. And so why workers' wages? Well, workers' wages, number one, workers can do something that machines can't, and that is they can quit their jobs if they don't feel like they're being compensated. Obviously, machines can't do that. They can organize to form unions, but clearly machines can't. And also workers have other considerations like benefits and whatnot. So workers, because they're human, have different sorts of needs. And I've long posed this question to students that for the same dollar cost of an input, would you rather have people or machines do the same work? And almost uniformly throughout year after year after year that I've been doing this, everyone will say machines, machines, machines. That's probably, the instincts are probably pretty correct on that. We're seeing this over and over again, where labor is being replaced by machines. You can go into a McDonald's now and make your order on a kiosk, and then see like one person, and maybe you don't even talk to that person. Maybe they just say, "Okay, order 58 or whatever," and then up you go, right? And we're seeing this increase in places like Japan. A lot of food is vended in machines themselves, where you walk up and swipe your card, and then they sort of pop up in a machine. So you get the idea that automation is there. But nonetheless, labor, despite all this, despite the Industrial Revolution that's been going on now for 200 years, and the fact that jobs are replaced by machinery, labor still is employed. I mean, we just talked about the fact that the unemployment rate is about as low as it's been since World War II, despite the fact that there have been people who are sort of sitting on a bench, taking it easy for a while, or maybe aren't coming back at all, who knows? Because they find work, they find other jobs come along, technology creates some opportunities and opens up other opportunities, and new markets come about all the time. So somebody who was working at McDonald's last week, maybe working at Amazon this week, and delivering orders that are fulfilled on the internet. So you kind of get the idea. So in the short run, firms are able to take advantage of that by raising prices, but not raising wages. But eventually what? Workers will demand higher wages. Now, how do they demand higher wages? Because we see this again and again, and textbook authors do this where they say workers will demand higher wages, but they don't really say how. And it almost sounds like it's a unionization effort. Keep in mind, though, that at least in our economy, unionization does not represent, unions don't represent that much of the private sector workforce. In fact, they are mostly a public sector sort of phenomenon where they organize at the federal, state, and local level. I know we have a union here at C&M, but we're public employees, and so that sort of makes sense that we have a union to represent our interest and negotiates on our behalf and all that. Most workers don't have that. Now, there was a time in which there were a lot more private sector workers. I know I'm not a private sector worker, but there were private sector workers who were much more represented by unionization, where those wage increases were negotiated year after year after year through collective bargaining and all that. So it's not really so much that. It's not really so much that. When we say workers demand higher wages, we're saying they leave to go elsewhere. Or they simply say we need a higher wage. Or maybe if it's in some settings, workers have been known to say, you know, I've got another offer. I would love to stay here, you know, yada, 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 that sort of conversation. But gosh, they're offering me $18 an hour versus the $16 an hour I'm earning here or whatever. And sometimes your worker, your employer will be smart enough to say, okay, well, I will match that. I will pay you $18 per hour. Sometimes they won't, you know, it really depends. It is a sort of a chaotic environment. But the reality is that firms, and we're talking about suppliers of goods, remember, we'll recognize that as prices are going up, wages at some point have to go up. I mean, I think I talked about the example in class when I was a banker, and we had a commercial client of ours who never raised their wages ever. And they were paying their workers minimum wage year after year after year. And this was a very poor area. It's a very rural area, very poor area. And I just don't know how these workers were making it. And I mean, I think maybe some earned a little bit above the minimum wage, but I mean, it's really hard to live on minimum wage as a full-time worker. If you're a 16-year-old, that's one thing, but you're probably not working full-time. But if you're a person who's an adult, that's difficult, obviously. So those are exceptions, really, to the rule. Most employers are going to have to acquiesce. And I certainly, in my experience in the business world, I know that when we were lagging behind our competitors paying wages, we got the message, and we would institute just automatic across-the-board bumps in pay, particularly for hourly workers. And that also allowed them to participate in higher overtime pay where that was possible. Okay, and a lot of employers prefer to pay overtime rather than hire another worker because you don't have to pay benefits for additional benefits for overtime. So as we are walking this up here, guess what? There's a sliding in this direction to the aggregate supply curve. So as a result of this, what happens is aggregate supply curve shifts left. Why? Well, it's because of the fact that I think I have a slide that talks about what some of these factors are that can shift, and one of those is changes in input costs. And I'll come back to that here in a second. Well, that's an input cost, labor, and it could be any. Now, by the way, when we see changes in input costs, I don't want to make it sound like labor is the only input cost that's going to change, because if there's general inflation happening, right, throughout the economy, then it's probably the case, what is the case, that all other prices or most other prices are rising also. That's what an inflationary condition does. It brings everything up. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing the price of pretty much everything go up. And we really haven't seen this phenomenon to this degree, this quickly, in about 40 years. And I know everybody here is probably experiencing it. And it isn't just gasoline. Yes, gasoline is one of the things that is a thorn in our shoe, no question about it. But it's a lot of other things as well. It's food, it's energy, it's clothing, you name it. I mean, tell me the good, and it's likely to go up. Now, there are goods that go down in price, but those are usually due to other considerations. So there's a left shift. Remember, this is not all that different than the the discussion back in chapter 3, what can cause shifts to a supply curve in the micro model that back in chapter 3, the change in input costs. So if costs are going up, supply shifts left. So aggregate supply shifts left as a result of that particular phenomenon. So we basically walk it back to there. In the case of a walking downward where input costs are falling now, including labor, then what happens? What's just the opposite condition where now firms will supply more output as a result of being able to lower input costs, including wages where it's applicable. And so as a result, you've got a rightward shift. So you've got a leftward shift as prices are rising. You've got a rightward shift as prices are falling. And so what have you got here? You've got a connect the dots sort of situation where in the long run, you've got an aggregate supply curve that looks something like this, that is vertical. And whenever you have anything that's vertical or horizontal on this sort of two-dimensional plane, and what it really means is it is in the long run oblivious to what is going on in the function or the variable that it's parallel to. In the variable it's parallel to, that's the price level. And we're saying long run aggregate supply has nothing to do with the price level. It is what it is simply because of the fact that suppliers are going to produce the output. In other words, they're going to produce GDP based upon their own expectations of the future, all of those things which go into their own individual supply decisions. In the short run, they'll make these sorts of decisions. If wages are going up, firms will lay workers off, right? And in fact, we see this happening, right? Why is this leftward shift happening in the first place? It's because of the fact that, if wages are going up, that it will be the case that firms would rather lay workers off than let workers go. Much more on this here in a minute when we talk more about some of Keynes's ideas about the labor market. This in itself is not necessarily a Keynesian idea because we're still really just finishing up, mopping up the rest of chapter 11, but it will come up and these things are realities that are going on in the macroeconomy. This is not a particularly controversial setup, this idea of long run aggregate supply, even though the long run aggregate supply and the focus on that is more of a neoclassical concentration. Nonetheless, I don't think there's too many arguments from the Keynesian side to that. So it's going to be Keynesian versus neoclassicists. And we're going to sort of begin that debate today and carry it into next week. And if we are able to get to the chapter 14 dealing with money banking, then we will. But if not, it's not a major tragedy. We'll deal with that. Okay. All right. So questions about that as to how we get to long run aggregate supply. Well, then just to go over then what some of these changes are that can cause shifts. We talked about this idea. The first one, this I think is the last PowerPoint. Oh no, we got one more on today's package. And again, as I mentioned earlier, well, we got a couple more actually, where we talked about this idea of why shifts can happen due to changes in input costs. That would be one example. Labor, but also materials. Right now, I think that if oil prices stay as high as they are, and they may stay there for a while. And I know I talked on Tuesday about the fact that prices will at some point come down, and I think they will, but maybe not right away. And remember, in the short run, which is where we live, we're going to probably have some elevated prices for a while. And those firms that rely a lot on fuel are going to have to make some decisions because that's an input cost to them. And do they hire as many workers? If a worker leaves, does that worker get replaced? Keep in mind too that it's not always the case that the boss comes in on Monday morning and says, you are fired. I'm sorry, you're laid off. Really sorry. That sort of thing. It's often the case that a person or two will leave and they just simply, their jobs won't be refilled, and that everybody else in that work unit will have to sort of cover for that person's lost productivity. That happens a lot. It happens an awful lot. And so you get the idea that it's not always this blunt instrument of letting people go. It's sometimes just not replacing those who are going to leave anyway, because people do leave jobs, and that's just the way it goes, right? Okay, so changes in input costs are one. Changes in technology is another. Now here is the interesting and I think remarkable and sort of beautiful thing about technology is that it's almost always responsible for a rightward shift in aggregate supply. And the reasons for this are pretty simple. If technology is advancing, we're talking about the supply side here. If technology is advancing in some industry and your competitor has gotten a hold of that technology and is using it, then you are really forced as a competitive measure to also adopt that technology. But in adopting that technology, presumably it's better and it allows suppliers to do their work better, cheaper, and faster. Otherwise, why adopt it in the first place? I mean, nobody's going to go out and buy technology, that is not as good, at least as good as what it's replacing. Now, I understand that goods wear out, so you have to go get a new machine, whether it's a new copier or whatever. But that's not really what we're talking about. Copiers are not exactly new technological developments. We're talking about something that is a real technological breakthrough, whether it's in medicine, whether it's in manufacturing, whether it's in graphics and fine art. If somebody's got the new thing, you pretty much have got to get the new thing in order to be considered a player and being really in the same sort of ballpark. So, and that's a rightward shift because it makes your work more productive. I can imagine that when the automatic scanners first were used by retailers, and what preceded those were simply cashiers ringing the goods up as they came. They had price tags on them. They were just simply ring them up. They were either stamped or ticketed on there, however they were physically rung up. Well, that obviously takes time, and it costs firms money to hire workers to do that, to check people out. And today, obviously, it's much, much faster. And I don't know about you, but I would much prefer to check myself out at the grocery or at wherever, the department store, than stand in line and wait for somebody. And there's always something that goes wrong when there's I don't know what it is, but there's always something that happens. And they've got to turn the light on and wait for the supervisor to make his or her way down the long aircraft carrier that is the front end of Walmart. And I don't have these problems when it's just me. I just scan, and go, that sort of thing. So again, technology makes our jobs better, cheaper, and faster. And so it's almost always an improvement to the economy, but it's a rightward shift. But it's forced on us oftentimes by competition. Also, government policy, taxation, and regulation. Now, if the good news was that productivity shifts aggregate supply to the right, taxation and regulation often shift them to the left because they raise the cost of doing business. And this is not all that different than our discussion back in chapter 3 about what can cause a left shift to supply in general, increasing taxes, increasing regulation. All of those impose costs. Certainly, direct financial costs in the case of higher taxes, if taxes are going up, but even higher regulatory costs, which may be direct or indirect regulatory costs, that is maybe time spent in complying with regulations and whatnot, whether it's on things like labor rules, which are always changing, they're always evolving. Employers have got to keep up on them. Smaller businesses in particular sometimes lag behind keeping up on things like changes to labor law. They've got to really keep up on that, because these do change and they are required to comply. But no, they do impose a cost, no question about it. And so as a result, they're there, and I'm not saying they're not there for a reason, but they do impose a cost. Okay, and if they go down, they obviously can cause it to shift to the right. And it does seem like there is this sort of push-pull that goes on within market economies, where particularly at the political level, where you've got maybe the more liberal political actors in office who want to impose more taxes and regulation, and then when they are done with their term, because we tend to move these guys in and out a lot, then we have more conservative actors who tend to lower taxes and regulations. So it's this back and forth, which is natural. It may also make the planning, long-run planning from business firms a little more difficult, because you just don't know what the planning or what's going to be the case in the planning horizon. It really does make our lives more difficult, those of us who are on the supply side, because we just really don't know what the future holds in terms of taxes and regulation, both of those. Okay. All right. And then the next slide deals with changes in the aggregate price level And this sort of deals with inflation and deflation, and but particularly inflation and what the causes of this might be. And just real briefly here, what we're really getting at is, particularly in the case of inflation, deflation is a little more, I mean, we defined deflation earlier as a general fall in the overall price level, which as opposed to inflation, which is a general rise in the price level. But there are really two kinds of inflation though, and we should sort of model what these are just real briefly so that we can kind of move ahead here. There's the first kind of inflation is that which is known as demand pull inflation. So if we were to model aggregate demand, and we'll say we got AD0, and we've got short run aggregate supply here, and short run aggregate supply here, and we'll put a little zero subscript by that which we are going to be shifting here. And let's say that we start out with some initial condition of some P0, Y0. And this is an example of what we call demand pull inflation. This is generally considered to be the most common form of inflation generally. And that is the idea that there's excessive aggregate demand in relation to aggregate supply, which doesn't have a chance to catch up. And so as a result, yeah, it's good for the price level, it's good for GDP. It raises GDP, but at the price of higher goods and services prices. We are going to talk about that as we wrap up chapter 12, when we talk about something called the Phillips curve phenomenon. Yes, we might get higher growth, but we also get inflation as part of the bargain. And if you think about some of the times in which inflation has been the most prominent in our economy, 1960s, 1970s. In the 70s were really sort of the culmination of a long period of government pouring on aggregate demand. That is, a lot of this shift in AD was due to changes in government spending. Government was spending lots and lots of money on brand new programs, lots of new bureaucracy. There was the Vietnam War to pay for. There was the space program, which was in itself not that expensive in the long run, but nonetheless were costs. There were additions. There were new social programs like Medicare and Medicaid, which came about in the 1960s. So lots of new spending, and it did create inflation. It did give a boost to the economy. The economy was growing pretty rapidly throughout that period, but it was also inflationary. So we'll talk about this idea of the inflation and unemployment trade-off. Higher growth means lower unemployment, but it also might mean higher inflation. Well, that sounds a lot like where we are today, doesn't it? Well, but so does this. So does the other scenario where we've got this going on, where let's say we start with some Y0 and some P0. We've got aggregate demand relatively the same. Excuse me, now we've got a shift to the left in aggregate supply because of some supply condition, some supply constraint, which is causing a problem. And it's falling backward. We're losing some steam in GDP, but we're getting inflation. This is really a bad circumstance. This is called cost push inflation. Cost push inflation. And in some cases, I think we have a little bit of this going on right now, frankly, because of the fact that we've had restrictions in supply. There is still unfulfilled supply that does not meet the aggregate demand throughout our economy. I don't think there's any question about that. Particularly, we hear all the time about firms that can't get a hold of parts, can't get the raw materials, can't get this, can't get that, simply because of the fact that they rely upon international sources or even domestic sources that can't get them there quickly enough because there aren't enough truck drivers, there aren't enough train engineers, and then once they get there, there are not enough people to unload these goods, and so there are some real supply constraints, and as a result, it's sort of pushing this up. This could probably be, I think the best way to explain our inflation at the moment is probably it started this way, even though this is probably considered much less common. In fact, very often, I think most textbook definitions of this phenomenon will usually describe this as something that is really devastating that happened to an economy, such as a famine or a big drought or a war or an outbreak of disease. Well, that might be an explanation here that has caused that. And we usually, I guess in more normal times, whatever that is, we would usually say that those are unusual circumstances. Well, I think this is sort of a pandemic. Let's hope a pandemic is an unusual circumstance. We all hope and pray that's the case. We don't know, but I think probably we had a little bit of cost push to kick this off, which I think is the explanation for why our federal government kept insisting that inflation was transitory. That was the word that kept being used month after month to explain inflation. That once these supply issues work themselves out, and once we got supply back normal, shifting to the right again, the price level would come down. Well, it hasn't come down. I think a lot of it's because aggregate demand is rising as the economy is going back to work, because we are seeing growth. So I think it started here, and we did have a pretty stagnant economy in the pandemic, to the point where I don't know that we've actually classified that period yet as a recession. It does take a little bit of time before the analysts decide that it was a true recession. But now we've got a lot of growth, and we've got some inflation to that, and it's sustained. And as I mentioned to the class a couple of days ago, the Federal Reserve Chairman came out last week and said, yeah, we're probably behind the curve, something which a lot of us have been saying for a long time, that it was not transitory, it was probably likely to stay. And guess what? It's been around, and it's probably not going away. And unfortunately, they're going to probably have to raise rates here anytime now, within the next few days. Next week, it looks like, and keep going throughout the year. And I know that there's never a good time to raise rates, and it just seems like when they do it, people say, "Oh, there's a war going on, and gas prices are going up, and you're raising interest rates." Well, yes, and they probably will, and that's not good news, but that is what happens. Also, there's something called demand-induced recession and the so-called ratchet effect. I'm going to come back to that. I talked a little bit about sticky wages. I'll talk about sticky prices here in a bit. Let's put that to the side just a bit, particularly this, what we call downward price inflexibility. I'll talk about the ratchet effect here in a minute. And then a decline could cause deflation, which we know is possible to happen. But then also, and I don't know to what degree we talked about this last time, I want to talk about these first two, disinflation and hyperinflation. And then we'll get to stagflation here in our chapter 12 discussion when we get to the Phillips curve discussion. So the first of these is something called hyperinflation. I'm sorry, disinflation. So what is disinflation? So disinflation is really a policy objective. So when we say disinflation, it sounds like just another word for deflation, but it's not. Disinflation means that we are willing to accept some inflation, but just not as much as what we're experiencing now. And if you were to go back, not that anyone is going to do this, but if you were to go back and look at the minutes of the meetings of the Federal Reserve during the inflationary times of the 1970s, they would talk repeatedly about trying to obtain disinflation, try to squeeze out some inflation from the system. They weren't looking for deflation, that is a fall in the price level, because that's not good either. So what they were trying to do is to bring the price level down. Now, one thing that's interesting, and I know that we probably don't talk much about it in the text, and maybe we don't, as economics instructors, talk about it enough, but the idea is that policymakers want a little bit of inflation. And the idea is, and it kind of goes back to this, another one of these automotive and driving metaphors, and that is that with inflation, it's like the speed limit. If the speed limit is 55, do you usually go 55 on the freeway if you're going between towns or whatever, or do you maybe step it up to 60? And you probably step it up to 60 if you're normal, or 65 or whatever, right? 65 might get you a ticket, 60 probably would not. But 60 will get you there faster. And are you really risking life and limb to do that? Probably not. You're probably not doing anything that's too risky, but you are getting there faster, and so you probably will. And if it's, say, 75 on the freeway, and you're between here and Flagstaff, will you go 75? Well, maybe you will. Maybe you'll go 80. And is going between 75 and 80 that much more risky? Probably not. Will it get you there a little faster? A little faster. So that's the idea, is pushing the envelope a little bit, because if you're going 60 between here and Flagstaff, it's going to take you longer, no question, right? So maybe you should step it up a little bit, and in so doing, take a little bit more risk, but not that much more, and yet improve your overall performance. That's the idea. Pushing the envelope a little bit is the idea behind allowing a little bit of inflation. It lets us know that we're there, because if we have zero inflation, then it probably means that we are not operating our economy that efficiently. We like to see a little bit of inflation. And in fact, for the last several years prior to this pandemic, the Federal Reserve was trying to get the inflation rate up to 2% because they wanted more economic performance that is coming out of the financial crisis of 2008. And that seems so long ago, but it's taken a while to get to that point. Now we've got more inflation than what we want. So disinflation is the goal. A little bit of inflation, but not very much, okay? 2% is probably considered to be acceptable. And there's nothing that's magic about that, because I can recall back in the day where 4% was considered to be an acceptable inflation rate, because that was a lot better than the 10%, which had been experienced year after year toward the late 70s and early 80s. Okay, the second of these cases is an extreme case of inflation that I think was even covered back in the previous segment of the class. That was hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is when prices are going up by thousands of percent per year, and it really indicates that an economy is out of control. The money supply is out of control. If the one definition of inflation that is oftentimes used is too many dollars chasing too few goods, well, this is way too many dollars chasing too few goods, and so the dollars can't be worth that much. It's like monopoly money. And what happens in those economies is that people tend to revert to barter systems. They tend to trade goods for goods, or they tend to use other countries' currencies. I know that when we had a lot of inflationary conditions in some of the South American states like Argentina, Chile, Brazil, that the US dollar became very desirable because it was a stable currency relative to those currencies at the time. They eventually got it together, particularly Chile, which is a very strong and mostly stable economy. But sometimes currencies can get unstable. They didn't have the wildly high hyperinflation. The hyperinflation that is most often cited is that of the African state of Zimbabwe, which has had wildly out of control inflation for just years and years and years, really decades. But it's a very strange government, and there's lots of civil strife. A president who was very unpopular and refused to leave office and whatnot. So that is a very unique situation. Okay. All right. So questions for me about anything with regard to Chapter 11 before we move into talking about Keynesian economic theory. Okay. Well, so when we talk about this theory of where we're going here, we can say that over time there are two broad theoretical divisions within macroeconomic thinking, and that is the Keynesian school on the one hand, named for the namesake is a British economist named John Maynard Keynes, who did his major work in the 1930s, as I mentioned. And Keynes's work was published his major work was published in 1936, and it was called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And it is a very long work. It's a very difficult work to get through. And in fact, it starts out on page 1 by saying, this book is primarily for professional economists. And you can see why as you get into it. And it's just very, the first time I read it, I had to write down the variables that he was talking about, because he would say, let's call the supply of labor A, and let's call capital stock A prime. And it was like, why? I mean, why not call labor L or something like that? And I mean, because he would come back to, okay, A prime, and it's like, what? It's a difficult work to follow. And he wrote it very quickly. He acknowledged that he was writing it quickly, but it was a response to the Great Depression. It was a prescription for what to do about an economy, a macroeconomy, which at the time was all the industrial world for the most part, that could not get out of the doldrums of a Great Depression. So the answer was what to do about it. And he built a theoretical model which really still survives and really formed the basis of what macroeconomics is today. So that's one set of theories based upon Keynes's major work of the time. And it's pronounced Keynes, not Keynes, the way it looks like Keynes. And it was sort of the mainstay. Today, the modern day economists who adhere to Keynes's work, who tend to be called neo-Keynesians, also are sort of styling themselves as the quote unquote mainstream school of thought. That is, they want to sort of reclaim the mantle of dominance that the Keynesians frankly lost around the 1970s and really until maybe say the early 2000s. And that is the neoclassicists had lots of dominance. And certainly in the years in which I was going to college and graduate school, the neoclassical flavor of this was going strong. And we'll talk about some of the differences and some of the characteristics of these a bit more next week when we sort of lay out the differences between them, because there are a lot of differences between these two particular theories. But so when we talk about Keynes, what we're really talking about is the fact that he was a short-run theorist dealing primarily with a depression that was underway at the particular time, okay? So in particular, what he was looking at was this. If you just take a look at the economy as a whole, that he talked about this idea of a gap, where if you had full employment GDP, which I believe your book calls Y sub P, which is potential GDP, it's the same thing. Full employment GDP or potential GDP are the same thing. That is, it's the GDP level at which there is no cyclical unemployment. Remember that when we said full employment relates to unemployment that only has two elements to it: frictional unemployment, which is unemployment for incidental reasons where there are always going to be people out of work because they've quit their job to get another one, they've moved, they're graduating, they haven't found a job yet, they were terminated for whatever reason, a variety of reasons. And then structural unemployment, which is simply reallocating and restructuring the way the workforce is organized because of primarily technology, but also the inputs that are needed at the moment. So it's the same thing. But when there's a difference, though, between the actual and the potential or full employment GDP, then it's what we refer to as an output gap. So when this differs, we refer to this as an output gap. And the output gap can be either positive or negative, depending upon whether it is higher or lower. So if actual GDP then is greater than full employment or potential GDP, then we say that this is a positive gap, or what's known as an inflationary gap. An inflationary gap. That is, the economy is operating too quickly, and as a result, we've got an inflationary condition. And we need to dial it down. We need to figure out a way to hit the brakes, to keep the metaphor alive, to slow the economy down in order to squeeze the inflation out of the system, which is, I think, what our Federal Reserve is going to be doing beginning next week, is to sort of start tapping on the brakes to slow the economy down. And in so doing, it should squeeze out some of the excess demand in the economy. That sounds like very harsh rhetoric, and but the Fed itself has been saying we need to squeeze out some of the demand. There's too much consumption going on at the moment. And the way to do that is to slow the economy down, because as that happens, the interest rate on car loans goes up, and home equity loans, mortgages, and credit cards, and maybe not credit cards because those are pretty much permanently high anyway. But it's trying to slow demand down, and so doing to bring down the inflationary condition. It would be like just sort of that one way to achieve that disinflationary objective is to bring aggregate demand down, and so doing to bring the price level, to bring the rate of price increase down, not to bring it to negative where you have the price level fall, because that's not good either. That really signals an economy that's flat on its back. To pump it back up, we need some aggregate demand to rise and rise and rise just to accommodate our growing population. But we don't want we don't want falling prices. But the more important thing for Keynes was when actual GDP is less than full employment GDP, and that was a condition known as a recessionary gap. And this is where most of his attention is focused. So on this particular area here, that is when actual GDP is less than full employment GDP, you've got a recessionary gap, a recessionary output gap. And the question is what to do to fill that difference, this interval here, what to do to fill this particular interval. And the question is, how does an economy get itself right-sized to the point where actual performance can move to the right, where we can improve GDP, we can improve performance. And we're going to be sort of building a little model that is actually more discussed in Appendix B, which I probably should have assigned, didn't think I had to do that, but did not. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about that. And but it wasn't assigned in the syllabus, but I do think it's very helpful for explaining this overall theory. And in fact, a lot of how we arrive at some of the other theories as well. So we've got an inflationary gap and a recessionary gap. Now, the question is this. So if Keynes was writing during the Great Depression and he was saying, look, okay, first of all, he had a lot of criticisms over the existing theory of the day. And in fact, the term classical itself comes from Keynes himself, who said in a very audacious sort of conclusion that everybody who's come before me is a little bit wrong. And this is the way it is, because they're talking about special cases of full employment and special cases where the economy moves back to full employment if it gets out of whack. And in reality, the economy is very unstable. It's inherently unstable. Things get gummed up, jammed up, stuck. It's sticky, it doesn't move as flexibly as we'd like. And so as a result, we need some sort of agent in order to fix the problem. So he basically was the guy who termed everybody who came before them classicists. But then those who go back and sort of, who like that tradition of the classical economists, going back to Adam Smith and David Ricardo and even Marx in some cases. I know Marx does not sort of seem to fit in that list, but he is considered to be a classical economist. They sort of think, okay, well, they were onto something, and that was their assumption is economies are mostly okay. They don't really need government to be the agent of change. Whereas Keynes was saying, yeah, well, let me show you that why you were wrong. And he did it primarily through talking about this idea of stickiness. So when we talk about the issue of stickiness, first of all, we're going to link two markets together, an input market and output market, okay? And we're going to talk about the market for labor in general. And again, when we talk about labor markets in general, usually this is a micro model. But anybody who's taken micro yet, that you may have seen this. I know most people probably have not, given the fact that we usually, the way we number our courses is that most people take macro before micro, but it doesn't make any difference really which you take, at least in my opinion. And so what have we got going on here with regard to the market for labor? Well, first of all, at the outset, I want to make clear here that these are two separate sorts of markets here. We talk about the market for labor, we're talking about an input market, right? And the market for goods is an output market. Now, this is important because demand and supply and the roles that are played by the actors involved are different. So we talk about demand for labor here, we're talking about demand for labor by firms. Demand for labor by firms. And we talk about the supply of labor, we're talking about the supply of labor by households, okay? So we tend to think of supply as being supplied by firms, demand being by households. Well, that's for outputs, right? But for inputs, well, for the labor input, it's just the opposite, okay? So it's just the opposite. So in the case then of the market for goods and something, we go back to what we've already been working with before, and that is we've got supply and demand here, just like we always have. And then we've got the price and the quantity here. Nothing different. This is the model we've seen numerous times before. What's a little bit different here is this is a market for input, specifically labor. So what's the price of the labor? It's the wage. And then the quantity involved here is the quantity of labor specifically. So we'll put a little L subscript for that. Okay. So the wage is the price of labor, no question about it. Okay. So what happens in the case of a recession? How is Keynes describing this particular phenomenon here of a recession? He's saying that basically there is a feedback loop where two things are feeding into each other and they continue to feed into each other. And because one thing happens, another thing happens. And because that thing happens, the other thing continues to happen. And that is this interplay between demand and supply of labor, demand and supply of goods, that the two really work in the same direction. So if you consider the fact that a recession might start with, a recession that became a full-blown depression might start with a demand that starts at D0, and now we have a fallback in demand from some D0 to D1, right? In other words, the quantity of goods in this particular market, whatever the market is, it doesn't make any difference. This is just simply, these are simply microeconomic models here. It goes from Q0 to Q1, right? In this particular case, and there's sort of a fallback in that particular situation there. Okay, so here's what we've got going on in this particular instance. We've got a fallback in this situation. But because we've got a fallback in the demand for goods, we've also got a fallback in the demand for labor. Because why? Because people are demanding fewer goods. This is where we get into this notion of a feedback loop, where if there's less demand for goods, there's less demand for labor. And if there's less demand for labor, there are fewer wages being paid. And so as a result, we're not getting as much value for that. So there's nobody to buy the goods, and so who's going to buy those particular goods? So here's what happens in this particular case. You've got a fallback in this particular situation here, and you've got a reduction. You got a reduction in the in demand overall. So what you got going on here? And I probably should draw this a little bit further to the left here, but you've got an actual gap going on. You've got a gap in terms of quantity that is being demanded in the market. And this gap then is simply surplus output. There's excess supply. Excess supply. In other words, a surplus. But we've also got a very similar thing going on here, where there's also excess supply in the market. There's excess supply of labor going on here. And so as a result, we've got an excess supply which goes like this, where we start out with initial condition of quantity labor 0. Now we've got some quantity labor here. And as a result, we've got excess supply of labor. So the excess supply of labor and the excess supply of goods sort of mirror each other. An excess supply of labor is simply known as unemployment. And one thing feeds into each other because of the fact that why does it feed into each other? If people are demanding fewer goods for whatever reason, then firms are going to employ less labor. And if people are employed less, they're going to demand less goods. And if they demand fewer goods, they're going to lay workers. They're going to lay more workers off. And as more workers get laid off, it goes on and on and on. But here's the other phenomenon, and that there is a certain form of stickiness when it comes to wages. And here's what's going on there. And that is the fact that workers are reluctant to take lower wages. This differs a lot from the then existing classical theory, which said, okay, look, if there is an unemployment condition that results from a recession, then what will happen is workers will accept lower wages. Either they get laid off, they take a lower paying job until the economy recovers, and then they get back to full employment, where they work fewer hours per week. So they were working 40 hours, now they're working 28 hours or whatever. So, which is a form of wage cut, but they'll take lower wages until things get back to normal. But the reality is that workers don't like to take wage cuts. That doesn't sound like a completely alien concept to most of us. Workers don't like to take wage cuts. And so as a result, they would rather see some workers get laid off than have themselves all take a wage cut. This sounds very cruel, and it's something that's known as the insider-outsider relationship, which to my knowledge was first espoused by Keynes. And it goes something like this. If you're a firm that's got 200 workers and there's less demand for goods, in other words, you're overproducing, and so you've got to dial it down. Then what about the case of labor? Because you've got an excess supply, you're overproducing, you've got too much labor, and so as a result, you're saying, okay, well, we've got to lay 20% of the workforce off. So 40 of you are going to be laid off. I'm sorry, that's just the way it has to be, and we'll be letting you know within the next week. Well, that might be fine, or they could present it to workers and say, or if you all take a 10% decrease in wages, we can keep all of you employed. Well, what's the answer going to be by workers who've been there a while? They're going to say, look, I've been here for 10 years, and I don't want to take a wage cut. I don't think I should. Why should I take a wage cut just so that I can accommodate somebody who's only been here for 6 weeks? You know how this thing kind of goes. In other words, I'm more of an insider than this person is, who's an outsider. And so as a result, why not just lay that person off? And yeah, we'll work a little harder in order to keep our jobs. Yeah, we'll do that. And maybe we'll even get a little bit of overtime as a result of that. And so as a result, it is believed that workers would rather see other workers go than to take a wage cut generally in order to save their jobs. And I know that there have been examples, and it's been pointed out to me before, and I understand it, where workers have agreed to take wage cuts, particularly in the union setting, in the collective bargaining situation where they will all take a wage cut. That's a little bit different though, because that's an organized setting, because there is no coordination mechanism by which workers can take a wage cut. Your text talks about this lack of coordination. There's really no way by which workers are going to get together and say, let's all agree to take a wage cut, particularly in the absence of some sort of organized movement. By the way, the labor movement during the 1930s was not particularly strong. It was getting underway. It was very heavily resisted by lots of employers and frankly by the government itself, which did not really take kindly to this agitation for different higher wages and less working hours and all that. So that's an example of stickiness, that workers would rather keep the same wages, but rather see some unemployment happen, that sort of insider-outsider relationship, okay? So we're gonna talk a bit more about this idea of stickiness, but also the idea of how to close this output gap. In other words, we've got a change in GDP that's needed here. And what is that needed change in GDP? How do we get there? That's really the question. And what Keynes's solution was that government needs to fill the void. In fact, one of the differentiating factors that distinguishes Keynesian theory primarily from classical theory is the idea that economies are not this self-correcting sort of mechanism, that if an economy falls into a recession, it can fall into a depression, particularly when there's no flexibility to wages and prices, because firms also don't want to take lower prices. Because first of all, even your textbook talks about the idea of menu costs, that they can't, do they want to lower the prices and republish their price list and to advertise that they're taking lower prices? What does that signal to competitors? Does that signal blood in the water? What does it signal to buyers, that they can maybe get even lower prices if they're willing to budge on price? So prices are sticky just as are wages. And so as a result, this downward inflexibility leads to this sort of stubbornness whereby we have gaps in employment of labor and employment of all resources, which is a gap in production of goods, notably measured by the dollar amount, which is called the gap in GDP. The potential GDP or full employment GDP is not being achieved because you've got this stickiness that things are getting jammed up. And what differentiates Keynesianism from the classical theory is the idea that government is the answer to the problem. It can come in and put in needed aggregate demand to fill that particular gap. And I'll build the underpinnings of this theoretically. We don't have a great deal to talk about with regard to Keynes, but we will spend some time. Some of this is covered in Chapter B, in Appendix B, as I mentioned at the outset, and I didn't assign the reading, but it might, if you want to look over, you can. Since I didn't assign the syllabus, there won't be any questions directly on the exam from Appendix B, but I do think it's an important means, just sort of as a conceptual matter, to sort of build our understanding of where this idea is coming from, because really that was the first true macro model that was ever really constructed. Not just a micro model like this, but a true macro model of the economy, and used to explain why an economy can get gummed up and jammed up below full employment. Okay. All right. So questions for me about anything that I've talked about so far this morning? Okay. Well, we will pick up from where we left off next week. So everybody have a great weekend. If you have questions for me over the weekend, feel free to contact me. I'll see you later.